Commander Thessaly Varn had spent 30 years fighting wars across 6 different star systems, and she had seen enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. Now she was retired and wandering the frontier colonies with no real purpose, other than the inability to sit still in one place for too long on the backwater moon called Kethris 4. She found herself nursing a glass of cheap whiskey in a rundown cantina filled with miners and drifters and people who asked no questions. The frontier attracted such folk, and Thessaly fit right in with her scarred face and distant eyes, and the way she sat with her back to the wall, watching every door. She was 62 years old, and her body carried the marks of every battle she had survived. A plasma burn scar ran down her left arm, and her right knee had been rebuilt twice with synthetic parts, and her hands were rough and calloused from decades of holding weapons. But her eyes were still sharp, and her mind was still quick. And she had not forgotten how to survive. The night was quiet until the sky split open with a terrible sound. Through the dirty window of the cantina, Thessaly watched a ship come screaming down through the atmosphere, trailing smoke and fire like a wounded bird falling from the heavens. It was not a crash landing in the normal sense, but rather the kind of desperate, controlled fall that pilots attempted when they were bleeding out and just needed to stop moving before death caught up with them. The ship disappeared beyond the salt flats that stretched out past the edge of town, and a distant boom shook the glasses on the bar. Nobody in the cantina moved, the miners kept drinking, and the drifters kept their eyes down, and the bartender just shook his head. Slowly, frontier folk knew better than to investigate strange ships that fell from the sky, because such ships could carry pirates or plague or things far worse than either. Thessaly understood their caution, because she had seen what happened to curious people in lawless places. But something stirred in her chest as she looked out at the distant smoke rising against the stars. She finished her whiskey in one long swallow and set the glass down and walked out into the dust. Without saying a word to anyone, the night air was cold and thin and carried the smell of burning metal and something else that she could not identify. She walked for nearly a kilometer across the salt flats with nothing but starlight to guide her feet and the column of smoke to show her the way. The ship had carved a long trench in the ground before coming to rest against a rocky outcropping, and even in the darkness, Thessaly could see that it would never fly again. But she recognized the design immediately, and that made her stop and stare for a long moment. It was a Drakari vessel. The hull was covered in organic curves and scale-like plating that now hung torn and scorched from whatever had damaged it in space. The Drakari were an ancient species who had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they were proud and powerful and famously isolationist. They did not come to human space, and they certainly did not crash on backwater moons in the middle of nowhere. Thessaly approached the wreckage carefully because she had not survived 30 years of war by being reckless. The main hatch hung open and emergency lights flickered weakly from inside, casting strange shadows across the salt flat. She climbed through the twisted metal and into the ship, and what she found made her breath catch in her throat. A Drakari female lay crumpled against the far bulkhead, and she was massive. Even lying down, Thessaly could tell the alien was easily 3 meters tall with scales, the deep blue color of ocean depths, and wings folded against her back that seemed too large for even her impressive frame. The Drakari was bleeding badly, and her blood was unlike anything Thessaly had ever seen. It glowed with a soft copper-gold light and pooled beneath her body like liquid sunset, and the smell of it was strange and metallic and somehow sad. She was breathing, but barely, and each breath came with a wet rattling sound that Thessaly recognized all too well. This was a creature on the edge of death, but the Drakari Queen was not alone. Beside her crouched a small figure, maybe a meter tall, with scales the color of pale silver moonlight and wings that seemed far too large for her tiny body. A child. The little dragon girl looked up at Thessaly with eyes like captured starlight. and they were huge and luminous, and filled with a fear that the child was trying desperately to hide. She was not crying because Thessaly would later learn that. Drakari could not produce tears, but her whole body trembled with the effort of staying brave in the face of something no child should ever have to face. The girl had positioned herself between her wounded mother and the hatch as if her small body could somehow protect against whatever dangers might come through the door. When she saw Thessaly, she did not scream or run or attack. Instead, she simply looked at this strange alien creature with something that might have been hope. The child reached out and tugged gently at her mother's massive clawed hand. "Wake up, Mama," she whispered in a voice that chimed like small bells, despite the fear that colored every word. Her mother did not respond and did not move, and the child's trembling grew. Worse, then those luminous silver eyes fixed on Thessaly, and the little dragon girl spoke again. "Maybe that human will assist you." It was not a demand or a plea, or even really a question. It was simply a statement of hope from a child who had nothing left but hope. She was looking at Thessaly the way drowning people look at distant shores, and expecting nothing, but unable to stop hoping anyway. Thessaly had walked away from plenty of trouble in her life, because walking away was how survivors survived. But she had never been able to walk away from children. She stepped forward into the flickering light and knelt beside the wounded. Drakari and her hands were already moving before her brain had fully decided what she was going to do. "What is your name, little one?" she asked, and her voice was calm and steady because she had learned long ago that calm voices could hold back panic better than any medicine. The child watched her with those impossible eyes. "Kira," she said softly. "I am Kira of House Sorrental." Thessaly's hands did not stop working, but her mind caught the name and held it. Tight House Sorrental. Even humans knew that name because it was one of the 12 ruling houses of the Drakari sovereignty. This was not just a refugee. This was royalty. And Thessaly had just walked into something far bigger than a simple crash on a backwater moon. Thessaly did not ask questions, because questions could wait, but bleeding could not. 30 years of combat. Medicine kicked in before her brain could catch up, and her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who had kept soldiers alive. On battlefields across half the galaxy, she stripped off her jacket and tore it into long strips without hesitation, because the fabric was thick and clean and would serve better as bandages than anything else. She had available the Drakari female. Had 3 deep wounds across her torso, and each one was leaking that strange glowing blood at an alarming rate. Thessaly pressed the makeshift bandages against the worst wound and applied pressure while her eyes scanned for other injuries. The physiology was alien and familiar, but wounds were wounds no matter what species you were treating. Pressure stopped bleeding, and stabilization bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered when death was counting down. "Your mother," Thessaly said. While she worked, "What is her name?" Kira had moved closer and was watching every movement of Thessaly's hands with desperate attention. "Lady Valeth," the child said. "She is the 3rd voice of the High Council." She paused and her small voice wavered. "She was the 3rd voice. What happened to you?" "The purge has begun," Kira said, and the words carried a weight that seemed too heavy for such a small creature to bear. "Our own people came for us in the night, and my mother fought them so that I could reach the ship, and we fled, but they followed, and they shot us down over this moon." Thessaly had heard whispers about trouble in Drakari space rumors, had filtered through the frontier about civil war brewing among the great houses and ancient grudges, exploding into violence and something called a purge that targeted certain bloodlines for extinction. She had not paid much attention because it was not her war and not her problem, and the Drakari had never shown any interest in humanity beyond tolerating their existence. Now a dying queen's luminescent blood was soaking through her fingers, and a child was watching her with hope that burned like starfire. "The wound is deep," Thessaly said, and she kept her voice steady even though the news was bad. I can slow the bleeding, and I can keep her stable, but she needs real medical equipment and a proper surgical suite. There is nothing like that here, Kira said, and it was not a question because the child had already looked out at this barren moon and understood what kind of place they had crashed upon. No, there is not. Thessaly's mind was racing through options and discarding them one by one. Cantina had basic medical supplies, but nothing that could handle wounds this severe. The mining outpost on the far side of the moon was 3 days away. By ground transport, there was no hospital on Kethris 4 because frontier moons did not attract the kind of investment to build hospitals. There is a medical station on Varus Prime, Thessaly said finally. They have surgeons and equipment that can handle any species, and they do not ask questions about where patients come from. How far? 18 hours at full burn. Kira looked at her mother's still form and then back at Thessaly. Our ship will never fly again, she said. I know, Thessaly replied, but mine will. The little dragon girl stared at her with those luminous eyes, and something shifted in her expression. It was not quite understanding and not quite gratitude, but something deeper and more complex. Why would you do this? Kira asked. You do not know us, and you owe us nothing, and your people and mine have never been friends. It was a fair question, and Thessaly did not have a good answer for it. She walked away from plenty of situations in her life, and she had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems was a good way to end up dead. But she looked at this child who was trying so hard to be brave, and she looked at the mother who had fought to protect her daughter, and she found that walking away was simply not something she could do. Because you asked, Thessaly said. You looked at me, and you thought that maybe I might help, and that was either the bravest thing I have ever seen, or the most desperate, and either way, I was not going to prove you wrong. She finished tying off the last bandage and sat back on her heels. Now we need to move her to my ship, and that is going to be difficult because your mother is very large and I am just one human with a bad knee. I will help, Kira said immediately. I know you will, getting Lady Valeth out of the crashed ship and across the salt flats to where Thessaly had left her own vessel took nearly 2 hours. The Drakari Queen was incredibly dense with muscles and bones that had evolved on a world with gravity much stronger than most planets, and Thessaly's back screamed in protest with every step. But Kira helped as much as her small body could manage, and she never complained. And she never stopped moving, even when exhaustion made her stumble. They dragged and carried and pulled the unconscious Valeth through the darkness until they reached the landing pad where Thessaly's ship waited. The Resolute Spite was an old gunship that had been decommissioned and sold for scrap nearly a decade ago. Thessaly had found her in a junkyard and had spent years rebuilding her piece by piece with salvaged parts and stubborn determination. She was not fast, and she was not pretty, and her hull was scarred from battles that should have destroyed her, but she was tough, and she was reliable, and she had never let Thessaly down when it mattered. They got Valeth aboard and secured her in the small medical bay that Thessaly had installed for emergencies, just like this one. The equipment was basic but functional, and Thessaly hooked up monitors and 4 lines with practiced efficiency. Stay with her, Thessaly told Kira. Talk to her and hold her hand and let her know she is not alone. Will she hear me? Maybe not, but it will help you, and sometimes that matters just as much. Thessaly climbed up to the cockpit and started the launch sequence. The engines groaned and coughed and then roared to life with a sound like thunder in the Resolute Spite lifted off from Kethris 4 and turned her nose toward the stars 18 hours to Varus Prime. Thessaly looked at the engine readouts and made a decision that she knew she might regret. She pushed the throttle past the safety limits and felt the ship shudder as the engines strained beyond their design specifications. The readouts climbed into the yellow warning zone and then into the red 14 hours, maybe less if she was lucky, and the engines did not explode behind her in the medical bay. A dragon queen clung to life while her daughter held her hand and whispered words of comfort in a language that Thessaly did not understand. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, a retired soldier who had thought she was done with saving lives discovered that some habits could never truly be broken. The stars blurred past the cockpit windows as the resolute Spite tore through space at speed she was never designed to sustain. Thessaly kept one eye on the engine readouts and both hands ready to make adjustments because the line between maximum speed and catastrophic failure was very thin, and she was dancing along it with every passing minute. 2 hours into the flight, Kira climbed up from the medical bay and settled into the co-pilot seat without asking permission. Her small body barely fit in the chair designed for adult humans, and her silver scales caught the light from the control panels in strange and beautiful ways. She did not speak, and Thessaly did not push her, because silence was sometimes the only comfort available when words could not help. The child simply sat and watched the stars stream past and let the rhythm of the ship fill the space where conversation might have been an hour past, and then another, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Finally, Kira spoke. "Among my people, there is a concept that humans do not have a word for." Her voice was soft but steady, and she did not look away from the stars. "When someone saves a life, they create a bond that cannot be broken and a debt that cannot be measured. I am not looking for payment," Thessaly said. "That is not what I mean." Kira turned to look at her, and those luminous eyes held something ancient and serious that seemed strange in such a young face. "The debt exists whether you want it or not, because that is the nature of such things, and my people take these bonds very seriously. Kid, I am just trying to get your mother to a hospital, and after that you two can go wherever you need to go. And forget you ever met me. We will not forget." The certainty in that small voice made Thessaly uncomfortable in ways she could not quite explain. "You do not understand what you have done," Kira continued. "You have given us life when we had accepted death, and that changes everything, and that binds everything." She paused, and her wings rustled slightly against the seat. "My mother will want to reward you when she wakes, and she will offer you wealth and titles, and perhaps even lands within our territory. I do not want any of that." "I know," Kira said. "That is what makes this so strange to me." She tilted her head in a gesture that reminded Thessaly of a curious bird. "Why do humans do this?" "Do what?" "Give without expecting anything." In return, it was a question that Thessaly had never really considered, because giving without expectation was simply what you did when someone needed help. But she thought about it now as the stars flowed past and the engines hummed their straining song. "Maybe because we do not have time to wait," she said finally. "I do not understand. Humans live short lives compared to most species in the galaxy, and we grow old quickly, and we die easily, and we know from the moment we are born that our time is limited." Thessaly adjusted a control setting and watched the readouts stabilize slightly. "Your people live for thousands of years, and you have time to wait for kindness to come to you, and time to calculate the value of every gift and every debt. But humans do not have that time," Kira said slowly. "No, we do not, and so we learn early that if we want kindness in the world, we have to put it there ourselves without waiting for someone else to go first." Kira was quiet for a long moment. "That is either very wise or very foolish." "Probably both," Thessaly admitted. "Humans are complicated that way." The hours crawled past, and Kira eventually fell asleep in the co-pilot seat with her wings wrapped around herself like a blanket. Thessaly watched her for a moment and felt something twist in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. She had never had children of her own because the military had been her life, and there had never been room for family alongside the constant deployments and the endless battles. But looking at this small, Dragon girl who had faced horrors that would break most adults and had still found the courage to ask a stranger for help. She understood in that moment why people fought so hard to protect their young, not just their own children, but all children everywhere, because children carried the future in their small hands. And if you let the darkness consume them, then there was no point in fighting for anything at all. Kira slept and Thessaly flew, and the resolute Spite raced through the void with her engines screaming in protest. At hour 10, the first warning light appeared, engine coil temperature exceeding safe parameters. Thessaly acknowledged the warning and pushed on because slowing down was not an option when a life hung in the balance. At hour 11, the second engine coil started showing signs of stress, and the ship began to vibrate in ways that made Thessaly grip the controls tighter. She ran calculations in her head and made adjustments and coaxed every bit of speed from the straining engines that she could manage. Are we in danger? Kira had woken and was watching the warning lights with intelligent eyes. Probably, Thessaly admitted, but we are also making good time. You are destroying your ship to save my mother. Ships can be rebuilt. Kira studied her with that strange ancient gaze. You continue to confuse me, human. Join the club, kid. At hour 12, they burned out the first engine. Coil and the ship lurched hard to one side before Thessaly could compensate. She fought the controls and rerouted power, and kept them flying through sheer stubbornness and 30 years of experience with temperamental spacecraft. The second coil was redlining now, and she knew it would not last much longer. But Varys Prime was appearing on the sensors, and the medical station was broadcasting its welcome signal, and they were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. Hold on, Thessaly said. The landing might be rough. Kira gripped the armrests of her seat and did not look away from the approaching planet. The resolute Spite screamed down through the atmosphere, with her remaining engine howling in protest and her hull glowing from the friction of re-entry. Thessaly fought her every inch of the way and refused to let the ship do anything except exactly what she needed it to do. They hit the landing pad hard enough to crack 2 of the landing struts, but they hit it intact and alive, and that was all that mattered. We made it. Kira breathed. We made it, Thessaly confirmed. She was already unbuckling and moving toward the medical bay because they had arrived. But the race was not over yet. They still had to get Valeth to the surgeons before the fragile stability that Thessaly had maintained during the flight finally gave out. But for the first time since she had walked into that crash ship on Kethris 4, Thessaly allowed herself to believe that they might actually succeed, that this Dragon Queen might live, and that this brave little girl might not have to face the universe alone. The medical station on Varys Prime was a sprawling complex that served every species on the frontier, and the staff had learned long ago not to ask questions about where their patients came from. They took one look at the bleeding Drakari noble and moved with the kind of urgent efficiency that came from years of handling emergencies. Thessaly helped transfer Valeth to a medical stretcher and then stepped back as the surgeons took over. There was nothing more she could do now except wait and hope and trust that these strangers would fight as hard for this Dragon Queen as she had. The waiting room was cold and sterile and filled with plastic chairs that seemed designed to be as uncomfortable as possible. Thessaly sat down and realized for the first time just how exhausted she was. Her muscles ached from carrying Valeth across the salt flats, and her eyes burned from 12 hours of fighting a dying ship through space, and her hands were still stained with copper-gold blood that had dried to a dull amber. Kira sat down beside her and leaned against her shoulder without asking permission. The child was exhausted too, and her silver scales had lost some of their luster, and her wings drooped with fatigue, but she did not cry, and she did not complain, and she simply sat there and drew what comfort she could from the presence of this strange human who had appeared from nowhere. To save her world, you should sleep, Thessaly said. I cannot. Your mother is in good hands now. I No, but I cannot sleep until I know she will live. Thessaly understood that feeling because she had spent many long nights in waiting rooms, just like this one, waiting for news about soldiers she had fought beside, waiting to learn if friends would live or die, waiting and hoping and bargaining with any power that might be listening. "Tell me about your mother," she said, because talking was better than silence and distraction was better than fear. Kira was quiet for a moment, and then she began to speak. "My mother is the bravest person I have ever known, and she has led House Sorrenthal since before I was born, and she has always believed that the old ways of our people were wrong." "What old ways?" "The isolation," Kira said. "The pride that keeps us separate from the rest of the galaxy, and the belief that we are superior to all other species." She shifted against Thessaly's shoulder. "My mother wanted to change things, and she wanted to open diplomatic channels with other civilizations. And she believed that the Drakari had much to learn from younger species, like humans. I imagine that made her unpopular. It made her enemies," Kira confirmed. "The other houses called her a radical and a traitor, and when the Civil War began, they came for her first, because she was dangerous to them, because she offered hope to those who wanted change, and hope is the most dangerous thing in the universe to those who benefit from the way things are." Thessaly thought about that and found wisdom in it that surprised her coming from such a young creature. But then again, Kira had grown up in the halls of power surrounded by politics and intrigue, and she had probably learned lessons about the nature of power before she had learned to fly. The hours dragged past slowly, and Kira eventually fell asleep against Thessaly's shoulder, despite her determination to stay awake. Thessaly let her rest and kept her own vigil through the long night. She had intended to leave once the crisis passed, because getting involved in Drakari politics was not something she wanted any part of. Her plan had been simple: deliver them somewhere safe and disappear back into the frontier and forget that any of this had ever happened. But every time she looked at Kira sleeping against her shoulder, she found that leaving became a little bit harder to imagine. After 8 hours, a surgeon emerged from the operating theater and walked toward them with measured steps. Thessaly gently shook Kira awake, and the child sat up immediately with her eyes wide and her body tense. "Lady Valith will survive," the surgeon said, and both Thessaly and Kira released breaths they had not realized they were holding. The wounds were severe, and she will need time to recover, but we have stabilized her, and she should make a full recovery within a few weeks. Kira made a sound that might have been a sob if her species could cry, and she threw her small arms around Thessaly's neck and held on tight. Thessaly patted her back awkwardly, because she had never been comfortable with physical affection, but she did not pull away. "Thank you," Kira whispered. Thank you. You should thank the surgeon's kid." "I will, but I am thanking you first because without you, we never would have reached them." 3 days later, Valith woke up. Thessaly was still there because Kira had asked her to stay just a little longer, and she had never been good at saying no to lost causes. The Dragon Queen's eyes opened slowly and focused on the ceiling of the hospital room, and then turned to find her daughter sitting beside the bed. "Kira," she rasped, and her voice was weak but filled with relief. "I am here, Mama," Kira said. "We are safe." Valith's gaze moved past her daughter and found Thessaly standing near the door. The queen studied her for a long moment with eyes that held intelligence and curiosity and something that might have been confusion. "A human," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am. You saved me." "Your daughter asked nicely." Valith continued to study her, and Thessaly felt like she was being measured and weighed and evaluated in ways she could not fully understand. "Kira has told me what you did," the queen said. "You burned out your ship carrying us to safety, and you asked nothing in return, and you have stood guard for 3 days while I healed. I could not sleep anyway." "Humans confuse me," Valith said slowly. "Your species is so young compared to mine, and your lives are so brief, and your bodies are so fragile. She paused and seemed to gather her strength. Yet you spend your short lives doing things like this and helping strangers who have never shown you kindness and giving everything for people you have no reason to care about. Maybe. That is why we do it. Thessaly said, "We do not have time to wait for kindness to come to us, so we make it ourselves." Velith looked at her daughter and then back at Thessaly. "Kira told me she believes we owe you a debt that can never be repaid." "I already told her I do not want payment." "I know," the queen said. "That is what makes the debt so heavy." She reached out with one massive clawed hand, and Thessaly found herself stepping forward to take it. The queen's grip was weak but warm, and her scales were smooth and cool against Thessaly's rough skin. "You have given me back my life," Velith said, "and more importantly, you have given me back my daughter, and there is no treasure in all the galaxy that could equal such gifts." "Then do not try to equal them," Thessaly said. "Just get better and take care of your kid and try to make your corner of the universe a little less terrible." Velith smiled, and it was a strange expression on a dragon's face, but somehow it translated perfectly. "You are a remarkable creature, Commander Varn." "I am just stubborn," Thessaly said. "That is all humans really are in the end." "Perhaps," the queen replied, "but I am beginning to think that stubborn is exactly what the galaxy needs." 6 months after that desperate night on Kethris IV, the Drakari Civil War came to an end. It ended not with a final battle or a decisive victory, but with something that no one in the galaxy had ever expected. It ended because Lady Velith of House Serenthal returned from the dead. The rebel houses had believed her killed in the initial purge, and they had celebrated her death as the removal of their most dangerous opponent. They had not expected her to reappear at the gates of the High Council chamber with fire in her eyes and steel in her voice. But what truly shocked them was not her survival. What shocked them was who stood beside her. Thessaly had spent the months of Velith's recovery calling in old debts and reaching out to old comrades. She had contacted soldiers she had fought beside across 6 star systems, and she had asked them for one more mission. Not for pay and not for glory, but because she had asked and because they trusted her. Judgment 47 veterans answered her call. They were old and gray-haired and scarred from decades of warfare, and none of them had any business being on a battlefield anymore. But they came anyway because Thessaly had asked, and because the cause was right, and because humans did not abandon people who needed them. When Lady Velith walked into the High Council chamber, she walked with a human honor guard flanking her on both sides. 47 veterans in mismatched armor, carrying weapons from a dozen different wars, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Dragon Queen. The sight alone was enough to make 3 rebel houses surrender on the spot. They had been prepared to fight Drakari loyalists, and they had expected to face political maneuvering and diplomatic games. They had not been prepared for humans. They had not been prepared for the species they had dismissed as young and foolish and irrelevant, to suddenly appear standing in solidarity with the very queen they had tried to murder. The remaining rebel houses held out for 2 more weeks before they too capitulated. The war was over, but Velith was not content to simply reclaim her position and return to the way things had been before. She stood before the full High Council and announced changes that had not been seen in 10,000 years of Drakari history. The sovereignty would open formal diplomatic relations with the Human Federation. Trade routes would be established, and cultural exchanges would begin, and military cooperation would be discussed for the first time in their long history. The Drakari would reach out to another species as equals. The announcement sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The signing ceremony took place 1 month later in the Great Hall of the Drakari homeworld. Thessaly stood in the crowd wearing formal clothes that made her deeply uncomfortable and wishing she could be anywhere else in the universe. But Kira had asked her to come, and she had never been able to say no to that child. Velith spoke to the assembled dignitaries about the future and about hope and about the courage it took to change. She spoke about the purge and the Civil War and the dark days when it seemed like everything she had worked for would be destroyed. And then she told them about the human who had appeared out of nowhere on a backwater moon and saved her life for no reason other than that her daughter had asked. The hall fell silent as she spoke, and every eye turned toward Thessaly standing awkwardly in her borrowed formal wear. She wanted to disappear into the floor, but she held her ground because running away would dishonor everything they had been through together. When the ceremony ended and the dignitaries began to mingle, Kira broke away from her mother's side and crossed the hall toward Thessaly. The little dragon girl had grown in the past 6 months, and she now wore the silver circlet of an heir apparent upon her head. But her eyes were the same, still bright with that captured starlight, still holding that impossible hope that had first drawn Thessaly into her orbit. My mother asked me what gift we could possibly give you. Kira said she wanted to know what could ever repay what you have done. I already told you both that I do not want payment. I know. Kira reached out and took Thessaly's scarred hand in her small clawed one. So I told her the truth about what you have given us. And what is that? An example. Kira said simply, you showed us what it looks like to help someone without counting the cost, and to give without expecting anything in return, and to believe that kindness is always worth the risk. She squeezed Thessaly's hand. We do not repay you for that because we cannot, but we can try to become worthy of it. Kid, I am just a retired soldier with a bad knee and a broken ship, and I am nothing special. You are wrong, Kira said. You are the most special person I have ever met, precisely because you do not believe you are special. She looked up at Thessaly with those star-bright eyes. That is what humans teach us, you know, and it is not through your technology or your armies or your political power. What then? You teach us through this, Kira said, and she held up their joined hands. You show us what we could become if we were brave enough to care about strangers, and humble enough to help without being asked, and stubborn enough to never give up on anyone. Thessaly did not have words for what she was feeling. She had never been good with words in moments like this, so she simply squeezed Kira's hand back and let the silence say everything that needed to be said. Across the hall, Valeth was watching them with a small smile on her face. Around them, dignitaries from a dozen species were discussing trade agreements and political alliances and the future of interstellar relations. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was a little dragon girl who had looked at a stranger and asked for help, and a tired old soldier who had not been able to walk away. What mattered was the bond between them that had grown from that desperate night into something that would shape the galaxy for generations to come. What mattered was the simple truth that Kira had understood from the very beginning, that kindness was contagious, that hope was powerful, and that sometimes all it took to change everything was one person who was willing to say yes when it would have been easier to say no. Thessaly looked down at Kira, and for the first time in a very long while she let herself smile. You know, kid, when you asked me to help your mother that night, I thought I was just doing a small thing. And now I think maybe small things are not so small. After all, Kira smiled back at her, and in that smile Thessaly could see the future. A future where humans and Drakari worked side by side. A future where ancient walls came down and new bridges were built. A future that had started with a crashed ship and a dying queen and a little dragon girl who had pointed at a stranger and said, maybe that human will assist you, and against all odds, the human had.